The sound of a phone ringing in a dim office in Ouagadougou is not the kind of sound that usually changes history. Yet on that day it did. A young African president picked up the receiver and dialed one of the most powerful men on earth. On one end of the line was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, age 35, leader of Burkina Faso. On the other end, Donald Trump, the man who once held and still claims to shape the destiny of the United States. What happened next was not a conversation. It was a clash of worlds. To understand why this phone call matters, you must first picture daily life in Burkina Faso. In the bustling streets of Ouagadougou, women sell tomatoes under faded umbrellas, young men weave through traffic on motorcycles, and factory workers stitch clothing destined for faraway stores. For them, the smallest shift in trade policy can mean the difference between feeding their children or sending them across dangerous migration routes. That is what was at stake when news spread that Washington planned to slap a 30% tariff on all Burkina exports to America. 30% may look like a number on a page, but in real life, it is Sarah, a 23-year-old seamstress whose paycheck feeds her mother, 2 younger brothers, and an infant daughter. When the tariff takes effect, Sarah's factory closes. Her daughter loses access to medicine. Her brothers leave school to search for jobs that don't exist. And Sarah herself faces the impossible choice: endure hunger or attempt the perilous journey north toward Libya and Europe. That is why Traoré made the call. He was not negotiating for abstract trade figures. He was fighting for Sarah, for millions like her, and for the dignity of an entire continent tired of being told to stay quiet. The question that lingers after that call is not just what was said, but whether America is prepared to face the consequences of policies that may destabilize more than one nation. And so, we ask, when a small country speaks truth to power, does the world listen or turn away until the crisis arrives at its own doorstep? 3 days before that call, Traoré's economic advisors rushed into his office carrying papers that felt like a death sentence. According to leaked documents, unverified, Washington was preparing to impose a 30% tariff on everything Burkina Faso exported to the United States. To understand the scale, remember this: Burkina Faso exported nearly 480 million worth of textiles, cotton, and agricultural products to international markets in 2024. A sudden tariff of 30% would wipe out a third of those earnings overnight. For a nation whose per capita income hovers around $900 a year, that is not an adjustment. That is annihilation. Burkina Faso's textile sector alone employs over 60,000 workers, mostly young women. These factories don't just pay wages, they sustain entire communities, from farmers who grow the cotton to traders who sell food near factory gates. A 30% tariff is not a line in a spreadsheet. It is a chain reaction. Closed factories, bankrupt farmers, malnourished children. That is why the news struck like a thunderclap in Ouagadougou. And yet, what angered Traoré most was not only the size of the tariff. It was the way it was delivered. There was no letter, no warning, no diplomatic courtesy. Burkina Faso discovered its fate the same way the world did, through rumors, leaks, and the whispers of uneasy diplomats. To Traoré, that silence was the real insult. It said 22 million Burkinab lives were not worth a phone call. That night, Traoré told his closest aides that this was no longer about trade. This is about whether we are considered human beings or statistics, he said, unverified. The next morning, he instructed his staff to set up a secure line to Washington. His decision shocked even his ministers. No African leader in decades had dared to speak so bluntly to an American president. Most relied on intermediaries, on cautious memos, on diplomacy written in careful code. Traoré chose confrontation. When Trump's voice came through the line, it carried the confidence of a man used to dominance. He spoke of protecting American jobs, of keeping factories open in Ohio and Michigan, of how tariffs were necessary for America first. To him, Burkina Faso was a footnote in a larger political theater. Traoré let him finish. Then he leaned into the silence. "Mr. President," he said, Let me tell you about my economic interests. That was the moment the call shifted from routine to historic, because what followed was not the usual language of aid or dependency. It was the story of Sarah. Sarah is 23. She works 12-hour shifts at a textile factory on the edge of Ouagadougou. Her hands sew shirts and trousers that end up in discount racks across the United States. Her paycheck feeds her widowed mother, pays school fees for her brothers, and buys medicine for her infant daughter. But if the tariff takes effect, Sarah's factory closes. Her paycheck vanishes. Her mother goes hungry. Her brothers drop out of school to hunt for jobs that don't exist. Her daughter's medicine runs out. And Sarah, like so many young Africans before her, will look north, to Libya, to the Mediterranean, to the dangerous boats where survival is a coin toss. This is not trade policy, Traoré told Trump. This is human life. For the first time, Trump stopped talking. And that pause said everything. Because in that moment, he realized this was not a leader begging for aid. It was a leader demanding respect. Traoré pressed further. You can destroy our textile industry today. But when 10 million young Africans start moving toward Europe because their economies collapsed, don't call me asking why your allies face a migration crisis 10 times worse than before. His words cut through the usual diplomatic fog. He was telling Trump what few dared to: destabilize Africa, and the consequences will not stay in Africa. Outside the presidential compound, word of the possible tariff spread like wildfire. At the central market in Ouagadougou, traders whispered anxiously. One farmer named Issa, who grows cotton in the Central Plateau, put it simply: if America blocks our exports, our cotton is worthless. If our cotton is worthless, our children starve. For people like Issa, the tariff wasn't an international debate. It was the collapse of their entire livelihood. Meanwhile, in Washington, the news barely registered. Analysts dismissed Burkina Faso as a minor partner, irrelevant to America's overall trade picture. But they overlooked one fact. In West Africa, small shocks create big waves. The Sahel region, already fragile from droughts and jihadist violence, cannot absorb another economic earthquake. What seemed like an adjustment in Washington was, in Ouagadougou, a question of survival. And so the call continued. Trump talked about American steel and auto workers. Traoré countered with Sarah and Issa. Trump spoke of tariffs as tools. Traoré spoke of lives hanging by a thread. For 23 minutes, the conversation swung back and forth between numbers and humanity, between the logic of a superpower and the pain of a small nation. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of brushing Traoré off, Trump asked a question. What do you want? It was not an offer of help. It was not diplomacy. It was the language of negotiation, as if Burkina Faso's survival was something to bargain over. And that is when Traoré delivered the line that would define the call. I don't want anything from you, Mr. President. I want you to stop taking from us. The silence that followed lasted so long, Traoré thought the call had dropped. But it hadn't. On the other end, the President of the United States was realizing that this young African soldier was not playing by the old rules. The world would later ask, what triggered the pivot in Trump's tone? Was it Sarah's story? Was it the warning about mass migration? Or was it the blunt truth that America was not helping Africa? It was harvesting it. The silence after Traoré's words was heavy. For a moment, both men simply breathed into the line, the weight of history pressing down. Then Trump spoke again, but the tone had changed. It was no longer dismissive. It was cautious, almost curious. He asked Traoré to explain what he meant by stop taking. And Traoré did not hesitate. For every dollar of aid America gives Africa, we send back 5 in debt payments, in resource extraction, in unfair trade terms. We are not being helped. We are being harvested. That sentence, later quoted in African newspapers, struck a nerve. For decades, African leaders had framed their complaints in polite diplomatic language. Traoré cut through the veil. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, often praised in Washington as a gift to Africa, was, in his words, designed to keep Africans as suppliers of raw materials and buyers of finished goods, never competitors, never equals. In Washington, aides scrambled to take notes. In Ouagadougou, Word began to spread that their young president had confronted Trump directly. On social media, hashtags praising Traoré appeared overnight. Africa speaks and dignity first. A Burkina radio host said he did not beg for us. He demanded for us. Inside the call, Traoré pressed harder. He spoke of Burkina Faso's cotton farmers, generations of families who grew white gold, yet never saw its true value because it was exported raw and re-imported as expensive shirts. He spoke of gold mines, controlled by foreign companies, that left nothing but pits in the ground. He spoke of young Africans, the most educated generation in the continent's history, forced to migrate because opportunity was stolen before it was created. Why? He asked. Do you treat Africa with less respect than China? Trump did not answer. He shifted the subject to security cooperation, counterterrorism, military aid. But Traoré interrupted. Mr. President, the greatest security threat to Africa is not terrorism. It is economic despair. The line grew quiet again, because what he said was true. Statistics from the United Nations show that 70% of armed group recruits in the Sahel cite lack of economic opportunity as their main reason for joining. For every drone strike, there are thousands of hungry young men searching for purpose. When you impose tariffs that destroy jobs, Traoré continued, you are not fighting terrorism. You are feeding it. In the markets of Ouagadougou, ordinary people listen to updates on transistor radios. A vendor named Awa told a local journalist, for the first time, our leader speaks like we speak, with anger, with pride. In Paris, Le Monde ran a headline, Traoré challenges Trump, fairness, not charity. In Washington, CNN briefly covered the story, framing it as a tense call with African leadership. But mainstream coverage quickly shifted back to domestic politics, leaving the deeper meaning to fade. Yet within intelligence agencies, alarm bells rang. The CIA circulated an internal memo, unverified, noting that Traoré's rhetoric, if adopted widely, could destabilize US-Africa relations for decades. The Pentagon quietly asked whether new instability in the Sahel might demand troop adjustments. For once, a small African nation had captured the full attention of Washington. Back home, crowds gathered outside the presidential palace. Students carried signs, "We will not beg." Farmers cheered when state radio replayed snippets of the call. The atmosphere felt like a new Independence Day. Burkina Faso, long dismissed as one of the world's poorest countries, was suddenly at the center of a global debate. And still, the call had not ended. Trump, perhaps surprised by the boldness, began asking questions. What would a fair trade agreement look like? What exactly did Burkina Faso need? For the first time, he was listening, and Traoré seized the chance. He outlined a vision. Remove suffocating tariffs. Allow African countries to process their own raw materials. End aid programs designed to enrich foreign companies and respect sovereignty without strings attached. Africa does not need charity, he said. We need fairness. This vision, radical to some, was common sense to Africans who had lived generations of exploitation. Yet for Washington elites, it was dangerous. Fairness meant less profit for corporations, less leverage for creditors, less control for politicians. That was why the tariff plan had been conceived in the first place, to remind Africa of its place. But Traoré refused that place. He told Trump plainly, if America chooses profit over fairness, Africa will remember, and we will look for partners who treat us as equals. The call ended with a simple sentence from Trump. Let me look into this. Give me some time. It was not a promise, but it was more than most African leaders had ever heard from an American president. In the days that followed, African newspapers praised Traoré as a new kind of leader. Western analysts debated whether his approach was reckless or visionary. On the streets of Ouagadougou, ordinary citizens repeated his words with pride. We are not being helped. We are being harvested. The real question, however, was bigger than one phone call. Would this bold challenge mark the beginning of a new era of African assertion, or would it be crushed by the weight of old systems? Will the world act in time, before the next migration wave, before the next security collapse, before dignity is lost again? In the days after the call, Burkina Faso felt like a country standing at a crossroads. On the streets of Ouagadougou, vendors repeated Traoré's words as if they were scripture. Taxi drivers quoted him to passengers. "We are not being helped. We are being harvested." Students painted the phrase on walls near the university. The sense was clear. For once, their leader had spoken the truth openly, and the world had heard it. But beneath the pride, anxiety lingered. What would happen if Washington went ahead with the 30% tariff? In the textile districts, factory owners prepared contingency plans. One manager told a reporter, "If the tariff is real, I will have to close in 3 months. That means 600 workers gone, 600 families without bread." The ripple effect was terrifying. Each factory closure would devastate not only workers, but farmers who supply raw cotton, truckers who transport goods, and street vendors who depend on factory wages for daily customers. International economists warned of a domino effect. Burkina Faso's economy is tied tightly to neighbors in West Africa. A shock in Ouagadougou would spread to Mali, Niger, and Côte d'Ivoire. The Sahel region, already fragile from insurgencies and drought, could tumble into deeper instability. And instability in the Sahel rarely stays there. It travels. Migrants push northward, crossing the Sahara, reaching Libya, then spilling into the Mediterranean. Europe, already fractured by migration debates, would face a crisis multiplied. And Americans might believe such problems are distant. But as Traoré reminded Trump, chaos does not stay contained. When factories close in Africa, it creates markets for extremist groups. When farmers go bankrupt, smugglers recruit. When young men lose hope, they join militias. The drug routes from Latin America to Europe often pass through West Africa. Instability there strengthens cartels that also touch American cities. In other words, a tariff in Washington can translate, months later, into violence, migration, and crime that reach American shores. Meanwhile, in Washington, reactions were mixed. Some politicians dismissed the episode, claiming Africa was exaggerating. But intelligence briefings circulated quietly. One report, unverified, noted, economic collapse in Burkina Faso would increase regional instability, creating opportunities for jihadist groups aligned with ISIS. Another warned, mass migration from the Sahel could destabilize European allies, weakening NATO cohesion. These were not abstract risks. They were national security threats. Inside Burkina Faso, the call had already changed politics. Opposition figures, who once criticized Traoré, now praised him for defending national dignity. Radio commentators compared his stance to leaders of independence movements in the 1960s. "This is not about one man," said a teacher in Bobo Dioulasso. "This is about Africa standing up." Even critics admitted the call had electrified the population, but the challenges on the ground remained brutal. Inflation rose as rumors spread of disrupted trade. Families stocked up on food staples, fearing shortages. At the border with Ghana, truck drivers worried whether shipments would be turned away. A cotton farmer named Adama, 50 years old, explained it simply. "If they close our market, my children will not go to school next year. We will survive on porridge and hope." This was the civil cost. Ordinary people balancing dignity with survival. Politically, the call sent shockwaves across the continent. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, commentators debated whether their leaders would dare to confront Washington in the same way. Some praised Traoré for courage. Others warned he was gambling with his nation's future. In Addis Ababa, at the African Union, whispers spread of drafting a joint statement to back him. For once, Burkina Faso was not seen as a small, landlocked country, but as a voice for Africa itself. The strategic implications were clear. If Washington pressed forward with tariffs, Africa might turn decisively to new partners. China, already investing billions in infrastructure, would gladly deepen ties. Russia, eager for influence in the Sahel, offered security cooperation. Turkey and the Gulf states, seeking trade footholds, made overtures. Traoré's warning, "If America will not be our partner, we will find others," was not rhetoric. It was a roadmap. For the United States, the stakes could not be higher. Would it cling to outdated models that viewed Africa only as a supplier of raw goods? Or would it adapt, acknowledging that stability and fairness are security interests too? Americans over 60 may recall the lessons of the Cold War. Neglecting regions often created crises that returned multiplied. Today, the same is true. Ignore the Sahel, and the instability will not vanish. It will grow until it reaches back across the Atlantic. By the end of that week, Burkina Faso's newspapers ran headlines calling it the Call of Dignity. In Ouagadougou's main square, students gathered nightly, holding candles, chanting for fairness, for sovereignty, for a future where their labor was not devalued. The atmosphere was tense, proud, uncertain. One farmer summed it up best. He spoke for us. But now, who will act for us? And that is the question that now hangs not only over Burkina Faso, but over Washington itself. How will the United States respond? In Washington, the reaction to Traoré's defiance was divided. Some officials dismissed him as reckless, insisting that Burkina Faso was too small to influence U.S. trade policy. Why should we bend for a country that exports less than $500 million a year? One congressional aide reportedly asked, unverified. But inside the State Department and Pentagon, the tone was different. Analysts warned that ignoring Traoré's warning could backfire. If instability in the Sahel spreads, we will pay the price in security costs far greater than any tariff revenue, one intelligence brief concluded. American media gave the story fleeting coverage. Major networks mentioned the tense phone call, but soon returned to domestic headlines. Yet in Europe, the stakes felt more immediate. Editorials in France and Germany warned that a new wave of migration could overwhelm fragile political systems already under pressure. European leaders, caught between dependence on U.S. policy and fear of social unrest at home, quietly urged Washington to reconsider. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Chinese officials watched with quiet satisfaction. State-run newspapers highlighted Traoré's stance as evidence that Africa was rejecting Western dominance. Russia, too, seized the moment. Moscow's envoy to West Africa declared, "If America treats Africa as a child, we will treat it as a partner." The geopolitical chessboard was shifting, and Burkina Faso, for once, was at the center of the game. Even within Africa, reactions varied. Some governments worried Traoré's boldness could provoke retaliation. Others admired his courage. At the African Union, delegates debated whether to issue a joint statement demanding fairer trade terms. A Nigerian columnist put it sharply, "Burkina Faso has spoken for all of us." The question is, will we stand behind them? For Americans over 60, the echoes of history are familiar. In the Cold War, the U.S. often underestimated how small nations could tip the balance of global power. A forgotten country could suddenly spark crises that reshaped alliances. Today, Burkina Faso might be such a spark. The real question is whether this is the beginning of a negotiation or the beginning of a fracture. Is the call of dignity a turning point toward fairness or the first step into deeper conflict? Crisis just beginning? As the echoes of that 23-minute call continue to spread, the future of Burkina Faso, and perhaps Africa's role in the world, hangs in the balance. The Sahel is already one of the most fragile regions on Earth. Drought grips the farmland, insurgents test borders, and millions live one missed harvest away from hunger. A tariff shock, imposed without warning, could tip this balance into full crisis. In the next 30 days, we may see factories in Ouagadougou reduce shifts, sending workers home without pay. Within 60 days, cotton farmers could find their harvest unsellable, piling bales in warehouses while debts mount. Within 90 days, migration routes toward Libya may swell again, bringing with them the familiar tragedies of capsized boats in the Mediterranean. These are not distant problems. They are direct consequences of decisions made in Washington. For the United States, the stakes are not abstract. Instability in the Sahel fuels recruitment for extremist groups, destabilizes European allies, and creates ripple effects in global markets. For Americans, it could mean higher costs for security, more migration pressures on friends in Europe, and new fault lines in international alliances. The lesson is clear. Neglecting Africa's dignity today invites larger crises tomorrow. Yet there is still a window for change. Traoré's call has opened a conversation that many thought impossible. It challenges America and the West more broadly to see Africa not as a charity case, but as a partner with rights, resources, and aspirations. Whether Washington seizes that chance or wastes it will shape the next chapter of US-Africa relations. For viewers in America, especially those who have lived long enough to see the Cold War and 9/11 reshape global order, the question is deeply personal. What do we owe the next generation? Do we allow unfair systems to fester until they collapse? Or do we act with fairness and foresight before the crisis arrives at our doorstep? The people of Burkina Faso have spoken through their leader. Enough. Now the world must decide whether to listen. So ask yourself, if it were your town facing a 30% tax tomorrow, what would you expect your leaders to do? And what will we, as a global community, choose to leave behind for our children and grandchildren? Fear and instability, or dignity and security?